Thank you, Martin. As Martin said, I've got a background in technology innovation, and I've spent much of the last 20 years involved in the transition to a low carbon economy, which is it's exciting, it's scary, and it's really important. And so I was very pleased when Martin asked me to give this session, and because there's rightfully a lot of interest in getting to net zero, but there's also a lot of confusion about how to do it, especially for small businesses and social enterprises. How do you genuinely put your organization on a path to net zero without either having to devote your entire life to calculating carbon emissions, or being accused of greenwash or lack of ambition? And so this is understandable because the field is actually moving really fast, and there is a lot of greenwash around. So, but it's also important to get it right, particularly for social enterprises, charities, values-led businesses, where your reputation for doing the right thing is actually a fundamental asset. And amongst other things, I'm on an advisory panel for the Carbon Trust, which has given me a really good overview of what's happening. So today I'm going to share with you some emerging principles and frameworks that I find really helpful, and I think other organizations find helpful. So overall, my aim is that after this session, you'll understand about how to get your organization on a sound path to net zero. You'll have a few ideas about practical things you can do to reduce your own emissions, which you have discussed in a breakout group with others on this call. And we'll also do a bit of jargon busting because there is jargon around. So I will just start sliding my screen. All right, everything disappeared. And I will show you, we'll get going. Okay, is that coming? Yes, so hopefully you can now all see, my screen. So the agenda for this morning is to start by looking at understanding your carbon emissions. How do you get started? Then we'll look on to how do you actually set a target for reduction? What useful frameworks are there for that? We'll then touch on offsetting, which is an absolute minefield for greenwash and scams. And then we'll do a bit of creative stuff in a session looking at how can we imagine the future, how can we actually slash the emissions in order to meet our targets. And finally, just touch on how can we help each other, because there is a growing community of organizations that are doing the right things, that are trying to do the right things. And the more we buy from each other, support each other, encourage each other, teach each other, the faster everything will move. So to kick off, why decarbonize? I mean, as Martin has touched on, firstly, it's a moral imperative. If we don't do it, the world will quite probably become uninhabitable. A few years ago, I was on the board of British Antarctic Survey, and what is happening about ice melt and sea level rise is scary. It could quite easily be 2 meters this decade by the end of the century. And of course, things don't end at the end of the century. They carry on for thousands of years. Secondly, it's actually a business, a commercial imperative. And this slide I'm sharing here comes from a really excellent presentation by the Carbon Trust, which I suggest you have a look at. Here's the link to it. When you get sent the PDF of this PowerPoint, which I think Emma's going to be putting into chat, you'll be able to use the link. So as they point out, why do it? One of the reasons is it cuts costs, but why waste money on an energy bill that you don't have to waste? LED lighting, PV, pays for itself within a few years. I think it's often 1 or 2 years for LED lighting, 5 or 10 for PV. A second reason is that large companies are increasingly expecting their suppliers to take action, and we'll come to this as part of the Scope 3 carbon emissions. And so sooner or later, your big customers will be asking, what are your carbon emissions? And you need to be prepared for that, because they will be starting to make purchasing choices based on the carbon emissions of their suppliers. I mean, they will also be, of course, interested in price, but you need to be prepared for that. Customers expect it, particularly if you are an ethical business, a charity, a social enterprise. I also find much of my work is about being creative in organizations. And when you start thinking about how to decarbonize, it also often produces really interesting new ideas for new products, new services, how to transform your business, that are things that you actually would have wanted to do anyway, even if you hadn't been trying to decarbonize. And the final one is about reputation. You actually have to be seen to be doing the right thing, particularly if you are a social enterprise, a charity, a values-led business. And so, okay, so let's get on to looking at how do we understand our carbon emissions. And it's understandable everybody's confused, because there is so much greenwash around about this. It's shocking, but there is a very useful framework. Sorry, before I get on to talking about the framework, how do you get started? The first thing to do is to measure and declare the carbon emissions from your own operations. And these are called Scope 1 and 2. And as I'll explain on the next slide, I'll explain to you what these are. You then set and commit, and I would advise it's a science-based target to reduce them. And that means that you're reducing them in line with us achieving a 1.5 degrees C overall temperature rise worldwide. So that's your fair share. And then you actually start reducing them. To go further, you might want to include the wider emissions from your value chain rather than from your own operations, and those are called Scope 3. Again, I'll explain what that means. And you might consider paying voluntary compensation. And you'll note I'm talking about compensation rather than buying offsets. And again, we'll come to that further on as to why I prefer that approach and why that is a more respected approach. So Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. This is a really useful thing to get your head around. So Scope 1 and 2 are your organization. It's the darker blue, you have control. Scope 3 is everything that you and your organization kind of touches on. And you have a bit of control and a bit of influence, but maybe not entire control. So Scope 1 is your fuel, and that is your gas, your petrol, diesel, oil, coal, if anybody used coal. I mean, usually in most small businesses in a city, it's your gas for heating. If you are, for example, a refrigeration business and releasing refrigerants, it also includes emissions like refrigeration. If you were a farmer and you had cows, it would be the methane produced from your farming operations. So it's a really direct fuel. Scope 2 is also energy, but it's basically your purchased electricity. And of course, that makes a difference. Is it green electricity? Does it come from renewables, or does it come from a fossil fuel power plant? And so those Scope 1 and Scope 2 are basically your energy use. And very often when people talk about going carbon neutral, what they mean is they are reducing their Scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions a bit, and they're buying offsets. And that is pretty scam-like. Scope 3 is everything else you touch on. So, for example, it's the purchased goods and services. If, for example, you buy, your product is made for you in China by a third party under contract to you, it's scope 3, all that steel. If it's then shipped to you from China, the shipping emissions as it's shipped to you are scope 3. So definitely under your control, because you could choose to move it to the UK. I mean, it may be cheaper to do it in China, but not necessarily entirely under your control. How your customers actually get the products that you sell them. Is it a download, or do you have to put it in the post, or do you air freight it? That's in the distribution bit, that's scope 3. Again, partly under your control, partly the customer's control. The business travel, do you fly? Do you take the train? Do you use Zoom? Employee commuting, again, sort of their choice, but you can influence it a bit. I was talking to some people about schools, you know, how do the kids get to school? How do the staff get to school? That's scope 3. Use of sold products. This is a biggie for the oil companies. When you see Shell and BP saying they're going to go carbon neutral, what they mean is they're going to reduce the emissions from their own operations, i.e. the energy that they use for running the oil well, not the carbon emissions from the use of the oil that they're pumping out of the ground, because that's scope 3. A responsible organization should be trying to reduce their scope 3 emissions as well, particularly the key ones. But of course, these scope 3 ones, you can see that they're a bit harder to measure than your scope 1 and 2, which is actually quite easy, because you just look at your bills for your electric and your fuel, and you look up the emissions factors. The final scope 3 one I put down here, it may or may not be relevant to anybody on this call, but it's your investments. It might be the pension that you run for your staff, or some organizations might have large quantities of land or financial investments, and often that, how you use that, is it invested in fossil fuels, or is it doing good things, is a really useful way of thinking about your scope 3 emissions. I think when you've got your head around this scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, it makes it much easier to think about how you reduce your emissions, where you start, and spot some of the potential scams that are going on. I mean, I perhaps shouldn't call them scams. They are a start, but they are not the full solution. And so on scope 2, it's a relatively easy one. You think, okay, this is my purchased electricity. Let's reduce that by getting 100% renewable tariff, a green tariff. Does that reduce that to 0? Well, I'm afraid it's a confusopoly. Buying your electricity from on a green electricity tariff is definitely a good thing to do, but that doesn't mean that you can use as much electricity as you like with no carbon emissions. The best way of having green electricity is to actually put PV or whatever on your roof and directly generate, store and use it. And then you've paid for it, you're using it. It is actually very low carbon. I mean, it's not absolutely 0, because there was some emissions involved in making the panels, but I think they add about 5 or 10% over a sensible life of the panels. Of course, if you sell the greenness to somebody else, then they've got the greenness, not you. And that's where on this slide, I'm talking about REGOs here, Renewable Energy Guarantees of Origin certificates. They used to be called the Renewables Obligation Certificates, but they've been ROCs, but they're now REGOs. And basically that's selling the greenness. So the best solution is to have your own PV, but that's not always possible to do, though it is now becoming so cheap, so cost effective. I would strongly recommend it if you have a suitable roof. If you don't have a suitable roof yourself, you can do what's called a power purchase agreement with a generator. But that's in general the sort of thing that a bigger organisation would do. And it's a genuine contract with a wind farm or a PV farm. You can get a green tariff. And some of those, for example, the Good Energy one, is actually based on a power purchase agreement that they have done with a wind farm. So it's pretty green. Some of them are based on buying these greenness certificates from other people. And I've given the link at the bottom actually, if you Google on it, there's a Guardian article. I haven't given you the link. There's quite an entertaining Guardian article about the way in which these REGO certificates sometimes get sold to two different organisations simultaneously. So that double counting basically means it's like fantasy greening. So if you've got a green electricity tariff, which actually, when you delve into the detail, they are basing it on REGO purchases. Personally, I would give myself about a 5 or 10% discount on the carbon emissions from that electricity tariff. It is definitely not a zero carbon electricity tariff. But it's still a bit better than the worst thing of all, which is to just buy your general electricity tariff and use it at peak times when the carbon intensity will be worst. So if you can, put some PV on. If you can't, look for a good quality green tariff, and Uswitch have this I think pretty good way of rating the various tariffs. Of course, switching tariffs just at this instant is a bit of a fantasy because you can't. But sooner or later, you will be able to switch tariffs again. So that's about scope 2. Remember, scope 1 is about your gas bill or under fuel for your vehicles and such things. So any questions? And I'm going to ask Emma, has there been anything in chat, or if anybody has got their hand up?
No questions in chat at the moment, Anne. So if anybody wants to put their little yellow hand up, we can call you through.
So it's all clear.
It's all clear at the moment.
Okay, that is really good. Okay, so the next section is about, now you've understood the terminology, how do you set and communicate your targets in a way that's actually proper? So you won't get people like me saying it's actually a scam. And and many are really impressed by an organization called the Science Based Targets Initiative, which has been going for quite a few years now. And an increasing number of the large corporates are adopting their really very rigorous framework. I certainly wouldn't suggest a small SME tries to do the full SBTi accreditation. And what that says is, you, as an organization, you put yourself on a path which is compatible with the world achieving a 1.5C temperature rise or a 2-degree temperature rise. When this set up, I think it started after the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. Most people were going for a 2-degree C reduction pathway, but things are becoming more stringent, things are becoming more urgent. And so from July, I think it's July 2022, they will not be able to do that. They would have to set a 1.5C pathway. And of course, there's various ways you can do that. And the SBTi recognizes that for some industries like steel or concrete, it's genuinely actually really hard to get down to zero without using offsets of some form. And so it allocates a sort of fair amount of reduction if you're in the concrete sector, and a fair amount that you can offset. And so, of course, there's all sorts of different sorts of ways of doing that, and that's your choice as to what your pathway is as a business. So these are the sort of pathways that organizations are setting, and there's thousands of them, thousands of organizations that are taking up science-based targets initiative. And as I point out here, increasingly they're focusing on 1.5C, and increasingly they are including key elements of their scope 3 emissions. And what that means for you as a supplier to them is that they will be wanting to know what your emissions are, so that they can calculate their emissions. And I suspect some of them will be really helpful in how they do it, and they'll set up nice ways of reporting it, and I suspect others won't. But still, you know, the burden and the duty will be on you to be reporting your emissions. And so here's a few examples of science-based targets. I think if we start by looking at Microsoft's, you may have heard that Microsoft is claiming it's going to be a carbon negative by 2030. And I rather like this figure they've given, this graph of how they propose to do it, because I think it explains the principle really nicely. So as you can see, not very little in the early days, and the red here is their own operational carbon emissions, electricity for their offices, their software engineers, the rest of it. And the blue is the carbon emissions from the use, particularly from the use of their products, and from the purchase of their products. So I suspect most of that is the electricity used in, you know, server farms and in everybody's laptops running their software. And here we are in 2020. They have been doing a little bit of buying offsets here. You see this dark green line here, and those are offsets for avoiding emissions, the things that would otherwise have happened, and they've paid some money to somebody who promised not to do it. And we'll come to this later. What they're proposing to do is to get thoroughly involved in carbon removal in the next decade, which will then balance out the emissions from the use of their products, and will get them to net zero by 2030. The good bit about this is that they're including their scope 3 emissions, because if all they did was include their scope 1 and 2, it's a bit of a gimmick. The bad bit is that nobody yet really knows how to remove carbon on that scale. But on the hand, you know, I think they are claiming, another good bit is I think they are going to saying they're putting 1 billion into research projects to help enable this, and that's good. So what you do as an SME or a small enterprise or any business without Microsoft resources, the Science-Based Targets Initiative has a process for SMEs, and this again is another example that came from the presentation that I gave you the link to earlier from the Carbon Trust, which a sort of typical statement an SME might make for a target is company X commits to reducing scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030 from, let's say, a 2018 baseline. Company X also commits to measure and reduce scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, company X will be net zero. And so that's actually a nice, simple thing to do. Take your own operational carbon emissions, scope 1 and 2, and halve them by 2030. And so I quite like those two. And so then when it comes to useful links, I've given you this slide. Again, we'll put it in put the PDF in chat. The BEIS publish a detailed spreadsheet of carbon intensity factors, so you can just look up, what is the carbon emissions per kilometre of my diesel van or something like that. And there's a variety of calculators here, and so you can just use a spreadsheet and work out your own carbon emissions and track them yourself for free, particularly the scope 1 and 2 ones, very simply. There's a variety of calculators available for free. There's a quite interesting one here from Spherix, which isn't free, but it integrates with your accounting packages. So like Xero, QuickBooks, Sage, and I haven't used it myself, but it looks good. If anybody has it, do put any comments on it in chat. If anybody's used any of these and particularly recommends them or doesn't recommend them, do put that into chat. Locally, it's not an accredited calculator, but I think it's quite good and quite useful, is the Cambridge Climate Change Charter, funded by Cambridge City Council and developed by Cambridge Carbon Footprint, which is available from this link. You might say, why do I bother to sign up to it? Well, it gives some quite useful tips and suggestions for things to do. And it's also, it's something that the City Council is paying attention to. So if you want to join the growing community of organisations, large and small, within Cambridge, that are showing they care about this stuff and they are actually taking action, that is really helpful because it helps empower the people in the council who are also trying to do the right thing. It shows there is business support for it. So I do urge you, it doesn't take long to just sign up to that too. And this scope 3 estimator, I gather, is actually a useful way of identifying the areas in which you might focus. Now, is my shipping from China going to be more or less important than my employee commuting, or I put on gigs and I have an audience of 10,000 come to my gig? Does that matter? Is it lower carbon to do it on Zoom or do it face to face? It can be helpful to help you work those out. So, any questions again?
We do have quite a few questions and comments floating around in chat now, Anne. So there's some curiosity over, for example, Suzanne asks, are servers included in scope 2 or 3? Now Spencer's actually helpfully trying to describe that if their servers are your own energy supply that you're running on site, then they're naturally going to fall into scope 2. I'm looking to you, Anne, for sort of confirmation on this. If there's something remote, such as Amazon Web Services, for example, they sort of fall into scope 3. Also,
I'd say that's exactly right. That's my understanding. I should say, I'm not a guru on this, but that's absolutely my understanding of it. If it's on your site, it's your electricity bill.
I mean, it's important to note, isn't it? This is also new. We're all working it out. Nobody is the complete guru on this, but luckily, lots of very clever people around Cambridge are working all this out for us. So thank you, Spencer, because you're also helping Ollie answer the question of how widespread the definitions for scope 1, 2, and 3 are. I mean, are they specific just to the UK, or are they used more broadly across the EU or even internationally? And we understand that's much more of an international focus.
Very, very much international, absolutely. Yeah, and the science-based target initiative is absolutely global. So that's why I think this framework is actually really important. 5 years ago, things were much more confusing. We're beginning to get an international language to how we think about this. And the rule book was clarified. The Article 6 rule book from the Paris Agreement was clarified at the COP26 a few weeks ago.
So the ink is really still drying on that.
The ink is absolutely still drying, and elements of it look encouraging and elements don't. We can discuss that later if people want.
I have another question. Cynthia asked just a bit before, how do you know if companies use REGO? Are they legally bound to report it?
I have no idea if they're legally bound to. They bloody well ought to be. So how do you know? The U-switch comparator was pretty good. The slightly annoying thing is you did have to register with U-switch, even if you don't want to switch. I seem to remember it was listing some companies that were using, whether they got their sort of bronze, silver, or gold, and the gold ones weren't using REGO. I also went and Googled, I mean, our energy supplier here is Green Energy UK, and we thought it was 100% renewable. And I went and I Googled on their site, and they because they do actually take the green stuff pretty seriously, they proudly proclaimed that they were only using REGOs. And I just Googled REGO, on their site, and it dug up that explanation. So we actually, when we can, we will probably switch. Or phone them up and ask, and give them a hard time when they tell you that it's 100% renewable and therefore it's zero carbon. You say, but it can't be. Do you mean I can leave the lights on all the time? And just push them. You may still get things their staff often don't understand it either, but it's definitely worthwhile showing that you care.
Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask directly? Chloe's been pointing out that at the county council and that her scope 3 emissions account for about 96% of their overall emissions. We often see that they're enormously high in proportion to scope 1 and 2. But to be aware, of course, that your scope 1 and 2 are potentially someone else's scope 3 in terms of that supply chain push. So the pressure is still to obviously address everything as much as we can.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And these things, you can't add up everybody's carbon emissions and say that's the national carbon emissions. But on the hand, if everybody is taking serious action to halve their scope 1 and scope 2 with every decade, and at the same time is helping everybody else in their supply chain decarbonize and making low carbon choices in their supply chain, actually then things will really snowball. So Spencer, I see you've got a question or a comment.
Hi, Anne. Thanks for your presentation. Yeah, no, I love what you've been saying, and I think it's directly in line with what I was hearing a week and a half ago at COP, specifically around the science-based targets and how it should be led by science and innovation, and how companies are getting to net zero on those specific pathways. Yeah. I was wondering how you were describing a little bit about science-based targets with respect to SMEs. At first, you maybe mentioned that it was quite difficult for smaller companies to fill out those forms and hit those targets. But you said also that science-based targets have an SME's specific location and portal. I was just wondering if you could expand on that a bit.
They have a simplified process. I confess I haven't embarked on it. But I think I've given you the. Have I given you the link? I'm just looking back. I'm not sure I did. If you go to the science-based targets, I gave you the link to that, and if you Google on in there on simple or search on there for the simplified process for SMEs. As I say, I haven't actually tried it. How simple it is, I don't know. But of course, the principle is actually quite straightforward. Basically, halve your scope 1 and scope 2 carbon emissions, which are easy to measure. Work out what you think your biggest scope 3s are, and do what you can to start reducing those. I mean, just as an example, my husband used to work for a small company called Delta T, based in Burwell. They made plant science instrumentation. They tried to, they did some insulation. They, did what they could to reduce their energy bills, and then they started looking at the scope 3. At the time, they didn't know it was called scope 3. And one of the people in dispatch came up and said, "Well, we on the default when we ship things is we ship them air freight. But how about we ship them, but made the default on the order form shipping a surface in Europe?" And as a lot of their customers were academics who didn't really care when the stuff arrived, as long as it arrived before the research project started, they were perfectly happy with that. And it actually was often a bit cheaper because some of this kit was really big. It was sort of augers for drilling holes through the soil and things like that. So by actually coming up with the idea that they changed the default on the website where people ordered their products from air to surface, actually made a really big difference to their carbon emissions. I think he told me that it dwarfed everything else that they'd already done. So adopting the principle of science-based targets, even if you're not following the precise detail and getting accredited by them as being on the path, I think we're pretty good if you're for small SMEs.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thanks, Anne. Thanks for the clarification.
Okay, good. So let's move on to the next greenwashing fest. Sorry, how can I move on? I'm just trying to make my PowerPoint move on. Not sure. Here we go. Okay, good. So what to do about offsetting? So another key principle to understand, which I confess it took me a while to get my head completely around this. So there's two sorts of thing mixed up here. One is avoided emissions, and the other one is removals. So if somebody's talking about avoided emissions, what you're buying an offset, which is basically avoided emissions, what you're basically doing is paying somebody else to promise not to emit the carbon emissions that they hypothetically would have done otherwise under business as usual. And they're cheap and they're sometimes beneficial, but it's really, really uncertain what the carbon impact is. So quite a common one is avoiding deforestation. And there was a thing called REDD, R-E-D-D, that was included in the previous Kyoto Agreement. Well, actually, it was post-Kyoto Agreement, but prior to the Paris Agreement. And lots of people paid and bought credits, deemed them that countries deemed that they'd reduced their emissions because they bought credits to avoid deforestation somewhere else. One of the changes in the Paris, the clarifications in the rule book at the COP26 was that actually basically those are worthless. They don't actually think they did anything at all. There's other projects, which is, for example, buying carbon offsets to enable people in developing countries who would otherwise be using firewood to have cook stoves which use less firewood and hence avoid deforesting firewood. I think that's a beneficial thing to do as an engineer. I like the idea. How much, and I'm sure it improves the qualities of people's lives and their health. Would it actually have happened anyway? Does it actually reduce the emissions? Bit hard to say. Greenhouse gas removals, on the other hand, are a bit more certain in a way. They're paying somebody else to, in theory, permanently remove your emissions from the atmosphere. So some of them are technical solutions, like this Swiss direct air capture system, which even as a former engineer, I look at, I think, wait a minute, you want to remove emissions on the scale of the oil industry using gizmos like this, come off it. There's other nature-based solutions. I'm quite excited about some projects to grow seagrass, which actually look like on a long-term basis, they are more effective than planting trees. Nice project that the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust is doing in the Humber Estuary, which I went and visited a few months ago. But actually removals are quite expensive. So in the competitive market for offsets, they tend to get overlooked. Nature-based solutions are attractive because they're often improving other aspects of health and biodiversity and everything else. But the durability can be a bit of a problem. So, for example, some of Microsoft's and the tech companies' removals were forests and trees on the Californian coast, which last year went up in smoke. And the technical solutions have been described quite convincingly as magic blood beans and unicorn blood. So some of them are actually fantasy. Some of them will happen because interesting things will happen, but it will take time. So not two. Yes. So those are the two important concepts: the difference between avoided emissions and removals. And there's two more important concepts to understand the difference between, which is, and this one is a kind of emerging definition. There isn't a sort of legally binding, globally agreed definition of either carbon neutral or net zero, but it's kind of coming. So net zero, this is the SBTi's definition of this is you reduce the emissions in line with a 1.5C science-based target. You are, I think, I'm paying compensation for your emissions. And then at the end, when you've reduced by, say, 90% or whatever it is, and you've got down to this limit of what you really can't decarbonize anymore, you can neutralize any hard to decarbonize emissions with greenhouse gas removals, not avoided emissions. So they've got this nice little graph here. Here are your emissions. We're going up, now they start coming down. Whoops, sorry. And you are paying a voluntary compensation to projects. You're kind of not pretending that it's cancelling those out, but it's compensation. It's saying sorry to the rest of humanity for the emissions that you're pushing in. And I like that idea. You treat it as a gift rather than a purchase, which completely changes the mental framework as how you think about it. And then, of course, here you've got your carbon removals in the little purple block, so that by this time you could say you are net zero. Carbon neutral is open to a lot more greenwash. And so here are your emissions coming down, and each year you pay for offsets, ideally accredited offsets, because there are some unaccredited ones that are complete scams. Usually, when people say they're carbon neutral, they're actually thinking about scope 1 and scope 2, particularly if they are an oil company or something like that, where the scope 3 emissions are a bit embarrassing. And usually it's avoided emissions rather than removals. And to some extent that's fair enough, because there's not enough removals projects available, because we don't know how to do it, because we haven't got the magic blood and the magic beans and unicorn blood yet. So I think that's an important difference that I urge you to think about when deciding what you want to do. I confess I am chair of an organisation called Carbon Neutral Cambridge, and I am beginning to wish that we called ourselves Net Zero Cambridge. So this stuff is changing and developing and not easy. So then the question is, how much offsets should I get? How much compensation should I pay? And it's worth bearing in mind that the social cost of carbon, what is the damage to society, to the planet, that's done by the carbon emissions that you emit, that we all emit today? It's been estimated at between £100 and £400 per tonne of carbon dioxide. Another rough calculation, some suggested that it was basically, roughly speaking, 1 year of somebody's life per tonne of carbon emissions that you emit, that I emit, that we emit. So how can one compensate for that? Is buying an offset at £8 a tonne adequate? Well, personally, compensating for taking 1 year off somebody's life for £8 doesn't really cut it for me. This is why I quite like the approach of saying, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pay compensation, and that's a voluntary donation. So as a principle, I developed and developed it like of paying a carbon gift. We took a flight to a few years ago to see our family in Tasmania. Made it a big trip, felt a bit guilty about the flights. We haven't flown for ages. And we made a carbon gift to a charity of between 10 and 100% of the guilt-inducing expenditure. So it's based on what we spent on the trip. The energy experts in Cambridge, the company Max Fordham, donate £100 per tonne for new woodland creation of the emissions they've been unable to abate. And I mean, they have been really thorough about reducing their own emissions. They've gone from an EPC F to an EPC A in their building, which I think is bloody good. And you can see their blog here, where they really thoughtfully explain what they've done in reducing their emissions in their buildings, and why they've chosen to pay this and why they've chosen forest carbon. So you can also buy accredited offsets. Climate Care are pretty good. You should definitely make sure that they're accredited. So the gold standard is the system set up by WWF and others. But they're fairly cheap. They're sort of £15–20 a tonne, which is based on the market price. When you talk to the projects about why did you set that price, it wasn't, well, this is what it costs for us to know that we've removed that carbon or locked up that carbon. It's, well, the market wouldn't pay, wouldn't if they're more than 20 quid, they won't sell. And you can, and there are some that are scams. So if you see a company saying we are carbon neutral because we've offset our carbon, the question I would always ask, and I would ask this of any council that's using offsets, is what price are you paying? There's always a risk that the project would have happened anyway. There's a risk that it might not be effective, like the forest burns down. And as I say, they're usually for avoiding emissions rather than removals. So, but it's quite a nice, simple process. And I think it's a useful idea to say, support a project that maybe suits your business. So Max Fordham are funding trees because they use a lot of timber in their buildings. If you're a paper-based business, that might be appropriate. If you were a marine business, you might want to fund seagrass or something else. Find a project that suits you. And then I would suggest buying more than 1 tonne per tonne of your emissions, so that you are compensating for the fact that some of these emissions won't actually work. But find a project that grabs your imagination and you want to support. And if you have investments, obviously decarbonize your portfolio, and almost more importantly, invest a proportion of it in early stage businesses where the money is actually going to that business to help it buy new stock. And of course, I suspect many of the small businesses on this call will like this idea, that people should be investing in small business to help them grow and therefore help the decarbonised supply chain. So that's the section on offsetting. How are we doing on time? We're reasonably okay. So any questions? And do you think offsetting is morally right? We may not have time to discuss this in great depth, well, not possibly much depth at all, but any questions, any comments? What have you got for us, Emma?
No questions in chat that I can see at the moment. Would anybody like to put their hands up? There is a good conversation going on in chat with people looking into various options that they might be interested in having conversations about afterwards, which is great, but no specific questions that I can see. Okay,
good. Okay, so we'll go on to thinking about the future and what you can do. So, what might my organisation look like when we're on the path to net zero? I confess, when Martin and I were originally talking about this, he asked me to say, well, what would it look like when we're at net zero? And the answer is, I haven't got a clue, because it's a long way hence. Who knows what's going to happen? I used to read a lot of science fiction, and I remember when I was a teenager, in the sci-fi, we would all have nuclear reactors in our kitchens and space flight by now, but the engineers would be using slide rules. They hadn't actually realized that IT and computing was going to happen. So unexpected things will happen. But what we can look at is, what's it going to look like on the path to net zero, where we're halving emissions every decade. So some of it is simple, really simple. So looking on the left-hand side, looking at scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, switching to a good quality green electricity tariff. easy. I mean, okay, not actually at this moment, but in principle, when the system gets itself sorted out, it will once again be really easy. In other things are, again, sort of kind of no-brainers. A few examples I've been involved in. Hitcham Village Shop is a small village shop, as you can see, in a village in Suffolk. And they were having horrible problems a couple of years ago with overheating, partly because the sun streams in the front of the shop, and partly because they had several really ancient freezers in there, which were struggling to work and were making the shop hotter and hotter. So we did a small thermal imaging survey for them and revealed which of the freezers were completely horrendous. They got rid of those freezers, they leased some modern ones, and the shop is now comfortable temperature and their electricity bill is a lot lower. In Newnham Sports and Social Club, near where I live, their energy bills were absolutely horrendous. So one of the committee and I got a step ladder out and we looked into the, lifted some of the ceiling tiles in the suspended ceiling of the snooker room and discovered this sort of, that there was some insulation in there, but it was mostly still in rolls. So they paid somebody to insulate it properly, unroll the insulation, seal up the extract vents that were still there from the days when people were allowed to smoke, which were sucking the warm air, what warm air there was, out into Cambridge. And it's now much warmer, much more comfortable, and the bills are lower. In scope 3, again, some things are really easy. Zoom and Teams mean that we actually need to travel much less. So we need to travel sometimes, and some meetings are really important and beneficial face-to-face, but we're all discovering what we can do really well online. I like the example of the Cambridge University catering service, who got very thoroughly involved in how to reduce their carbon emissions. They realized that ruminant meat was a big problem, big proportion of their carbon emissions. So they started by training the chefs in vegetarian and vegan cookery, because they realized that much of chefs' training is about meat cookery. And the chefs then redesigned the menus. And importantly, they put the vegetarian and the vegan options first on the menus and in the displays. And the result has been a 33% reduction in the carbon emissions from their catering within, I think, a year. I mean, astonishing. And Cambridge Sustainable Food, the local social enterprise, has been doing a lot of good work with them on that. I'm not sure if CSF are with us. And again, the example I gave earlier of Delta T. So some of these things are easy. So we thought we would let you go into breakout groups and discuss and try to come up with tangible suggestions for each other. Try to be practical and creative on these two questions. What would our organization look like if we reduced our scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions by at least 50% by 2030? And that might be practical suggestions. Well, yes, we'd throw out those old freezers and we'd have new ones. We'd not be traveling so much. We'd be doing X, we'd be doing Y. And secondly, if we slash the carbon emissions from at least one of our scope 3 emissions, and then discuss that together, and we'll share key ideas briefly, and when we come back together. So I'll give you about 10 minutes to do this. And I strongly suggest you, on a scrap of paper or something, note down any interesting ideas that your group comes up with, so that you can explore them later. And you may want to take a snip to remind yourself of, if you don't already remember it, what's scope 1 and scope 2 and what's in scope 3. So Emma, if you can send us into breakout groups, and I think I will be sent off to join somebody.
You will, Anne, thank you.
Thank
You'll
you.
have 10 minutes and have a countdown before they close and bring you back together for us.
Great. Okay, thanks, Emma. Hello. So I think we were all back from our breakout sessions. Does any groups have any particular ideas that came up in their discussion about things they're going to be doing in the next decade that will dramatically reduce their carbon emissions? And just say brief, in one word or so, what sort of organisation you are. Does anybody want to share anything? One of the ones that came up in our little group I liked was both. We had some people from the county council, both talking about reducing the carbon emissions from schools, and also another person was a business that was providing sports services to schools, and we were discussing about having an EV that would then be charged up by the EV chargers and PV that would be on the schools. So I like that idea. Anything else anybody wants to share?
I thought you were going to say get the kids to sort of do some exercise treadmill thing and charge the car.
Good idea.
We've got a lot of PVs on the Future Business Centre, but there's a lot more we could do. So I'd like to look at battery storage. I think there was some tech project that was coming to us actually about that. It's just it was going to be a massive container unit in the car park, but I think there are other versions that might be more acceptable. We want to look at electric car tax breaks. There's a really, really good scheme out there to offset your tax to get discounted leasing for electric cars. And the cycle to work scheme is very good that will now do electric bikes as well. I think that would definitely encourage a lot of people out of their cars. Improving the bike sheds actually, so they're more secure, because we've had a few bikes nicked and that puts people off cycling. It's really annoying. But if we could do something about that, I think I'm going to try and measure the carbon footprint and do the offsetting at least at £15 a tonne with one of the accredited schemes. I think that would be a good thing to do anyway. And I'm very interested in whether there's more we could do with the county council, with some of the things Chloe mentioned in chat, about whether there's a collective buying and offsetting we could do locally, buying locally produced electricity and offsetting locally as well. So, if we could circulate ideas on that would be great.
That is an interesting idea. Could we have a city stroke county wide scheme to let people effectively do a sort of power purchase agreement, but then getting around some of the electricity scams. Anyhow, I'm just checking.
I have a question from Duncan, Anne. He's got his hand up at the moment.
Yes, Duncan.
It wasn't so much a question as a sort of a answer to Anne's sort of plea for actions that might be taken or sort of aspirations. So, and I just want to say the biggest use of energy in our own business is in refrigeration. And I'm really interested, when we create the food hub, in exploring low energy solutions for food refrigeration, and in particular solutions that aren't reliant upon sort of hydrofluorocarbon gases, which of course leak into the atmosphere and have a greenhouse gas effects of many tens of thousands of times that of carbon dioxide.
I think it's really interesting. I suggest you go and have a look, Duncan, at the PDF I gave the link to from the Carbon Trust on the more first page of this presentation, because I know there is a section on that about reducing carbon emissions from the cooling chain, which is, I think there might be some useful ideas on that for you. But yes, refrigeration very often.
I arrived rather late, and apologies to everybody for that. So if you wouldn't mind perhaps putting that, did you put that link in the chat or something? Or
we did, Duncan, and we will also circulate it to everybody who's made it to this session and those that perhaps haven't been able to attend afterwards as well.
And maybe, Emma, could you post the PDF of the PowerPoint in the chat now, so that those who joined a few minutes after you first did it can just download it, just in case the follow-up email goes to junk folders or whatever. Okay, so any other suggestions that came from different people's businesses or organizations? Okay, so nothing?
Well, just to say that Cambridge reuse of electric vehicles is a big one for us, and I think that would be a really common thing across lots of business, wouldn't it? And we talked a little bit about the cost of these things as well, about how it's horrendously expensive to actually do the right thing. And wouldn't it be good if the powerful economies and the bandwidth that they showed during COVID, if they could apply some of that to this area, so that things would actually be a bit easier to acquire, especially for harder up businesses.
Yeah, I mean, I think this tax scheme that Martin mentioned is interesting, and certainly the tax break you get for e-bikes, like the cycle to work scheme, effectively lets a business halve the price of a bike or an e-bike for their employees, through basically just entirely funded through tax breaks. So it's a good deal. I bought myself a Brompton through my own little company many years ago, and it's still going strong through that scheme.
Gemma has a question for you, Anne.
Yeah, hi Gemma.
Hi Anne, hi everyone. Gemma from Cambridge Sustainable Food. It was just a response to what else are organisations doing. We're a small not-profit in Cambridge, and so our impacts are relatively small. However, we kind of feel like the biggest impact we can have is actually to help businesses, food businesses, to look at their environmental impacts, their carbon impacts, and to reduce those. So yeah, there's more work for us to do as an organisation, but I think the kind of bigger picture for us is actually what we could do to enable others to reduce their impacts on the environment.
Yeah, and Alex, are you muted?
Hello. Thanks for the opportunity. Just a couple of questions, and well, actually, first of all, I'll just talk about one of the things we're working on, and then I've got a specific question about it afterwards, which is partly answered by Spencer in our group, but I'd like to throw it out there. So one of the things we're working on, we just finished a grant from Innovate UK. Oh, by the way, we develop electric bicycles. So we design them. Currently, they're manufactured in Taiwan, where a lot of the bicycle and e-bike industry is located, and then shipped over. We just finished a grant from Innovate UK to design a modular bike, which removes all of the welding from the process, which is where quite a lot of the energy is used. But also because it's modular, it's suitable for a circular economy business model. So currently, if part of a bicycle frame is damaged, sometimes you can get it repaired, but often you have to scrap the whole bike. But if it's modular, you can just replace an individual part instead. So I was wondering, first of all, as a bicycle manufacturer, most of our emissions are going to be accounted for in scope 3, and by changing the process in that way, one of the things we have to consider is almost like a counterfactual. What would it have been like if we hadn't gone to a circular economy business model? But also, what impact are we having on the users of our bikes? So the idea is people are cycling to work instead of driving to work, and that could be seen as a sort of a carbon credit almost for the activity we do. And I was just wondering how that is accounted for in the model.
Yeah. So I mean, a lot of things it's been uncertain, and with any growing business, I mean, what a lot of people do is say, well, I'm going to look at the carbon emissions per unit of output. Yeah, that might be per pound, or that might be per bike, or whatever. Because if actually over 10 years you plan for your business to grow by a factor of 10, saying, well, it somehow doesn't make sense to just talk about halving your carbon emissions from your current base. So that's one thing that some companies do. In a sense, that almost lets you do the counterfactual. So as you say, what would the carbon emissions have been if we continued on the current model, and our strategic plan, they would have been doing that, and now they'll be doing that. Sorry, and the second point was about what the users are doing. So I didn't note it down.
So in theory, well, and in practice as well, because we have customers, we know they do this. A lot of people who ride e-bikes are no longer driving a car. Yes. And the carbon emissions of riding an e-bike, according to European Cycling Federation, is about 10% of driving a car. If you consider the total life cycle value of between an e-bike and a car, including manufacturing. So whether that could be considered a carbon credit, because it seems to me that kind of measurement is quite tricky to do.
Yeah, so yes, I think that's a really good point. And some organizations definitely would be itemizing that sort of on that the positive balance. And so there's definitely some organizations that say they're net zero, or will be including that sort of thing. For example, Quorn claim a lot of the credit for getting people off meat. They're saying, well, they're eating Quorn instead, and otherwise they would have been eating meat, and hence, you know, we've got a lot of, you know, carbon savings there, which means we're I can't really say they're net zero or carbon neutral. I think there's also a principle emerging that when you're talking about some of these scope 3, you know, carbon savings or whatever, they're not, you know, they are harder to measure. I mean, you may be doing a survey of your users to find out how much less they're driving, but inevitably there will be a bit of guesswork that's going on, and there's a bit of, well, how much is that your carbon saving and how much is it their carbon saving and stuff. And so you don't exactly sort of take one of them off the other. You itemize. If you're doing a report, and I would suggest reporting on your carbon emissions is important, particularly as a values-led business. So you say, well, you know, our carbon emissions per unit of GDP are scope 1 and scope 2 carbon emissions are reducing like so, and in our terms of our scope 3 emissions, we are claiming this sort of, you know, saving we've made from getting people out of cars, yeah, etc. So I think that's the way you would do it. They're kind of different sorts of numbers. So I don't think you can quite subtract one from another, but it's definitely worth doing because it, as you say, it definitely helps. So I think we should probably move on because
there's just one more question from Spencer, and if we can squeeze that one in, but I am looking at the time for everyone else.
I'll just be super brief. To Alex, to answer your question, it was a bit twofold. I think there's upstream and downstream you're thinking of in terms of emissions.
Yes, absolutely.
Upstream, you can be mindful of the responsibility, who owns the emissions of that modular aspect of your e-bikes. So you can start thinking about the circularity in the economy and who, if you are owning those emissions, if you're reusing those pieces. So that's one thing on the upstream. And on the downstream, I've definitely seen things in life cycle emissions where, just like Anne was saying, you want to account for how much in different aspects, and specifically in scope 3. But I've seen, for example, in t-shirts, life cycle analyses, there is negative carbon emissions if you, for example, recycle the fibers in a certain way, or those get sent back into circularity. So there's a lot of thinking about who owns the emissions in a circular value chain, not a linear value chain. And I'm certainly happy to talk about that offline, Alex.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things is some of these things you can't quite add up, because just to say, well, you know, we've reused this fiber, that, you know, well, for the point of view of the planet, is that really negative? I'm not sure that it is, but it's definitely a good thing to do. So it's good to track, it's good to help build the whole system. So I think I will now just share the final slide with some concluding thoughts, and then we can finish up, and we can get back to what the rest of what we were meant to be doing today. So just to conclude, my concluding recommendations for you. So start by measuring, declaring and reducing your scope 1 and 2 emissions, the emissions from your fuel and your electricity, and set yourself a scope 1 and 2 target for 2030. And I would suggest that's halving your emissions. It's hard to see why it should be anything else, unless you want to be more ambitious, which would be good. And then the next one is to identify and reduce your key scope 3 emissions where you can. And as we've discussed, that you may find that you can make an enormous difference, which completely outweighs your scope 1 and 2 emissions, which would be great. And then, though it's a kind of a different sort of number because it's not under your direct control, that may also help guide you as to what you want, how you want to develop your business, particularly if one of the aims of your business is to help with decarbonisation. You may think, well, that's good, let's do more of that. If possible, pay compensation for your unabated emissions, either by finding some nice carbon offset projects from Gold Standard, or somebody like Climate Care, and think about, choose a project that appeals to you and seems effective, and consider paying more, consider overbuying it, as it were, to compensate for the fact that some of these projects won't actually be reducing as much carbon as they claim. And the social cost of carbon, the damage that carbon emissions is doing, is significantly more than the current price of typical offsets. Or you can just sides pay, well, we're going to pay £X per tonne, as Max Fordham do, and give that to a project of your choice. Finally, be transparent about your approach and your assumptions, because these things are changing fast. And so, if you're buying offsets, put on your website where you're getting them from, what you're paying. If you're setting up a spreadsheet to calculate your carbon emissions, set up the columns so you're keeping track of both the carbon intensity that you're assuming, the carbon emissions per kilowatt hour, and your emissions, because those carbon emissions factors sometimes get revised, or if some customer of yours, big customer of yours, comes and asks how do you work out your carbon emissions, you need to be able to say. Share what you're doing and help others, because actually this helps mobilize real large-scale systemic change, and help your own supply chain decarbonize, both by sharing ideas, by asking them to, and by buying from organizations, large or small, that are doing the right thing, as opposed to the ones that are doing the wrong thing. So do download the presentation. If you want any more, do drop me an email, or have a browse on my website. In due course, Emma will send me the recording and we'll put this on my YouTube channel, or you can follow me on Twitter. So thank you very much.